recording is on, double checking that that worked today. Okay. Welcome again to ODSECS 27 and Mariam Wassif's talk, The Disordered Cosmos, Classical Rhetoric in Mansfield Park and Phillis Wheatley Peters. I can think of no better way to end the academic year than by listening to and learning from Dr. Wassif. Mariam is Assistant Professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University, which she started this year. She's just finished her first years. Her scholarship focuses on the relationship between literary style and material culture in an era of advancing capitalism and global unrest, both then and now. She is particularly interested in empire and power and brings to the reading of Romantic texts a deep analysis of their language, languages as steeped in histories of empire going back to the classics. She is published in European Romantic Review, in Philological Quarterly, and in the Wordsworth Circle. Her current book project is entitled Poisoned Vestments, Rhetoric and Material Culture in England and France, 1660 to 1820. And I think this talk is a bit of a preview for that, if I am not mistaken. The book identifies an encounter between ancient rhetoric and commercial modernity across the canonical genres of the period. And argues that rapid political, economic, and environmental change propelled major authors to restyle the classical trope of figurative language as the dress of thought. And by adopting a feminist and post-colonial perspective, it promotes our understanding of the interanimating relationship of rhetoric and history. In addition to her groundbreaking scholarly work, Mariam is at the forefront of efforts to make the Academy a more accessible and equitable place. Dr. Carrie Sinanan, who unfortunately can't be with us today, wanted to add her voice to round out my introduction to Mariam and to talk about this aspect of her work. Carrie says, and I quote, "Mariam is committed in many ways to ensuring racial equity in our pedagogy and research communities. For 3 years, she was co-administrator on the Women of Color Facebook page, which shared resources and events for a long 18th century community to center the work of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and other scholars of color. She was part of the 2022 anti-racist teach-in, leading on the question of how the Oriental, and especially Egypt, is represented and taught in the period. Her work for the KSAA has ensured that work once considered marginal is now represented centrally, and she actively supports women of color in our communities. In short, Mariam represents the kind of scholar and scholarship that ODSECS exists to champion." Today's talk, which brings together classical rhetoric, Phillis Wheatley Peters, and Jane Austen, speaks to all of these facets of Mariam's work. And so, without further ado, I turn the virtual floor over to Mariam. Take it away. You're on mute, Mariam.
Bound to happen. So while I'm setting up my screen share, I just want to say how grateful I am for this opportunity to share a work in progress, which is very rare. And so thank you to Elaine and to Carrie Sinanan for giving me this space to do that. And thank you to everyone who is here. So I'm going to dive in. This paper is entitled, as Elaine said, The Disordered Cosmos, Classical Rhetoric in Mansfield Park and Phillis Wheatley Peters. And it is indeed from my current book manuscript, which is entitled Poisoned Vestments, Rhetoric and Material Culture in Britain and France, 1660 to 1820. This manuscript argues that rapid political, economic, and environmental change propelled circa 1800 writers such as Wordsworth, Austen, and Phillis Wheatley Peters to restyle the trope of figurative language as the dress of thought. From antiquity, this trope linked rhetorical language and dress as examples of cosmos, a Greek term referring to the arrangement of words or things that names both the ordered universe wrested from chaos, the cosmos, and contrived arrangement, the cosmetic. In Romantic era literature, pastoral and primitivist traditions identified cosmos and its opposite, chaos, as two sides of the same coin. They criticized the cosmetic order of society as both a confining structure that establishes disciplinary boundaries and borders, and as an unstable arrangement subject to history's eternal fluctuations. These habits of thought were fueled by both a new consciousness of historical difference, as well as what Mary Louise Pratt describes as a new planetary consciousness of Europe's place on the planet. Writers like Wordsworth associated the historically and geographically determined outer dress of civilization with rhetorical language, a governing principle that was itself ungovernable, made of forms that migrate and come apart. Wordsworth's figure for these figures is that of the poisoned vestment from Ovid's tale of Hercules and Nessus, to which he alludes in the Essays upon Epitaphs. The emblematic poisoned vestment is particularly apt, given that Romantic era book paper was made of linen and cloth, and therefore the economic fates of the textile and book industries were intimately bound. My project both defines these critiques of Western modernity and establishes their limits from a feminist and decolonial perspective. It thus promotes critical movements that seek to open up wider, more global perspectives of Romanticism in the long 18th century, as well as to grapple with how these fields reproduce problematic structures. Chapter 5 of Poisoned Vestments reads Jane Austen's 1814 novel Mansfield Park as a novel of cosmic instability within the microcosmos of the English country estate. Like many of the texts the project examines, Mansfield Park draws deeply from Milton's Paradise Lost because of how Milton represents space, orderliness, and mobility. In his 1667 epic of humanity's temptation and expulsion from paradise, Milton activates the etymological origin of the word paradise in the Persian term paridesa, literally meaning wall around and referring to a walled park or garden. In Milton, the walled garden of paradise has many historical meanings. It serves as a figure for the enclosed country estate, but it also expands outward to the nation, the garden of England, England as garden, and to the imperial search for a utopia in the colonized world. When Adam and Eve realize their nakedness and attempt to cover it, Milton makes this comparison. Such of late Columbus found the American so girt, with feathered cincture, naked else and wild, among the trees on isles and woody shores. Milton is here comparing indigenous undress, not to innocent prelapsarian nakedness, but to shameful nakedness inadequately covered after the fall. At the same time, he is hinting at the notion that pre-Columbian Native Americans were the communities living closest to an Edenic existence, as yet uncorrupted by civilization. On the one hand, these comparisons associate indigeneity with the chaos of a nomadic existence, and on the other hand, they use indigeneity to criticize Western civilization as violent and disorderly in relation to the more harmonious, natural way of indigenous life. Both are damaging Western projections that tell us more about the colonizer than the colonized. But what I want to illustrate here is how this reference to Columbus and the American opens up possibilities for reading Paradise Lost in relation to the racialized patterns of global migration and world reordering that extended from Milton's era to the 18th and 19th century. Paradise Lost therefore offers an evocative model for writers of the long 18th century. It tells of an enclosed and divinely ordered space intruded upon by a dark, chaotic, and nomadic figure. There are numerous contradictory ways of reading this chaotic figure of Satan. We can see him as a colonizer who invades paradise, conquers its inhabitants with the eloquence of Greece and Rome, dresses their nakedness, and ultimately leads to their ruin. But we can also read him as a subaltern figure excluded from paradise, or a racialized anarchic threat to ordered civilization. Concurrently, paradise can have many different meanings. It can be seen as the idealized ordered civilization I mentioned, or as an exclusionary restrictive space. As Elizabeth Sarr and Lisa Smith note, radicals associated, quote, pre-enclosure methods of land with the Old Testament equivalent of the pre-lapsarian state. In such interpretations, enclosure is held to be the original cause of slavery in the world, and especially in England. Sower and Smith write, the expansionist centrifugal impulse of the English depended upon practices of framing, containing, and literally fencing, so that building walls was paradoxically a means of expansion. It would be inaccurate to impose such radical meanings on Milton or to read Paradise Lost as an anti-imperialist tract. Rather, I am arguing that Milton's allegory of a cosmic struggle that parallels political struggles over land and movement provides a compelling model for Austen in Mansfield Park, as does Milton's syncretism of antique and Christian narratives of universal origins. My reading of this Romantic period novel illustrates the book's paradoxical argument that studying classical influence actually helps us understand Romanticism as a specifically modern and globally responsive phenomenon. So I'm sure many of you have read Mansfield Park, but just in case you haven't, I'll give a brief plot summary involving this cast of characters. The novel's title, of course, refers to the family estate of Sir Thomas Bertram, a baronet, owner of a sugar plantation in Antigua, referred to simply as the West Indian property, among other euphemisms. At the beginning of the novel, Sir Thomas and his wife, Lady Bertram, decide to take on one of the children of Lady Bertram's impoverished sister, and the child sent to them is the novel's protagonist, Fanny Price. Fanny is not adopted by the family as kin, but rather imported as a commodity or contracted into a kind of indentured servitude, as Edward Said argues. She's intended to remain forever subordinate to her richer cousins, forever on the periphery of Mansfield Park. Remember, her aunt Mrs. Norris tells her, wherever you are, you must be the lowest and the last. Fanny's migration to her uncle's home is the first of what Said calls a series of both small and large dislocations and relocations in space that occur before, at the end of the novel, Fanny becomes the spiritual mistress of her new home, ultimately marrying her cousin Edmund. The dislocations and relocations Edward Said mentions identify Mansfield Park as a disordered cosmos, to borrow a term from physicist and critical race thinker Chandra Prescott Weinstein. The apparently secluded world of the novel is constantly trammeled by intruders and interlopers who throw already unstable relationships into chaos, forcing reconfigurations of the existing social world. These migratory interruptive figures highlight Jane Austen's drive to examine new patterns of social and geographic mobility at the turn of the 19th century. In a technique that is typical of Austen, she takes vast national and global phenomena, the enclosure of English common land, the migration of Europeans to the colonized world, the forced migration of Africans to the Americans, and reduces them to the domestic scale. On that level, she locates the English country house and its inhabitants at the center of the concentric circles of nation and empire. Post-colonial readings often interpret Fanny Price as a subaltern figure whom the dominant group see as physically and spiritually inferior. Feminist iterations draw connections between white English women's marital enslavement at home and racial slavery in places like Antigua, where Sir Thomas owns his sugar plantation. Indeed, Sir Thomas's return from Antigua will seal his daughter's marriage to Mr. Rushworth, a marriage to which she has agreed only so that she can escape home and confinement, and which she will eventually run away from. Another character, Mary Crawford, says of this marriage, "It puts me in mind of the old heathen heroes who, after performing great exploits in a foreign land, offered sacrifices to gods on their safe return." The old heathen hero referenced here is Agamemnon of the Trojan War, who agreed to kill his daughter Iphigenia to propitiate the goddess Artemis. The allusion thus connects Sir Thomas's ironically named great exploits in the slave colony of Antigua to the sacrifice of his daughter in marriage at home. Mary's remark exemplifies how Greek and Roman models of global adventuring were re-scripted in narratives of Britain's imperial conquest. In Austen's case, that expansion is seen to depend upon the fencing I mentioned earlier, not just the enclosure of land, but the consolidation of property through marriage. Critics such as Moira Ferguson and Gabrielle D.V. White often turn to the historical Austen's abolitionist sympathies to help make sense of these links between racial slavery and marital enslavement. In the letter of 1813, Austen claimed to be in love with abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, author of the 1808 History of the Abolition of the African Slave Trade. She likely derived the title from Mansfield Park from the 1772 landmark Somerset versus Stewart case, in which the Earl of Mansfield ruled that the African James Somerset could not be returned to slavery in Virginia once he had set foot on English soil. Indeed, the plot of Mansfield Park echoes the story of Lord Mansfield's adopted Black grandniece, Dido Elizabeth Belle. As Gretchen Holbrook-Grazina writes in Black London, Life Before Emancipation, Dido, who was raised alongside her cousin Lady Elizabeth Murray, occupied an unspecified middle ground, neither a servant nor completely family, but rather the category often filled by the poor relation. In Mansfield Park, with its allusions to the Mansfield case, Fanny is that poor relation who must be married off to someone of her station. She is implicitly rather than explicitly racialized, marked as physically and intellectually different, inferior, and not only out of place, but initially unplaceable, similar to Dido. But my book chapter demonstrates how Austen transfigures these contemporaneous phenomena of enslavement and migration through classical models and the classically influenced allegory of Milton. By looking at these specifically literary transformations of history, my reading illuminates how Mansfield Park figures its world as a jostling of figures like atoms in constant motion. While it appears to set the world to rights at the end, in many ways, the novel leaves us suspended in disorder. The uneasy mapping of Paradise Lost is one way the novel resists closure, for there is no neat allegorical correspondence between the epic and the novel. Fanny is at once a disruptive outsider figure, channeling Milton's Satan, and a redeemed new Eve or Mary figure who is the unacknowledged moral center of Mansfield. Nor is Fanny the only displaced outsider. When newcomers Henry and Mary Crawford arrive from fashionable London, they upend family relationships and seduce the Bertram children away from the linear path to marriage. And they are also implicitly racialized. The ironically named Mary has a brown complexion. Henry is pronounced absolutely plain, black and plain, but a gentleman with a pleasing address, again recalling Milton's Satan with his honeyed tongue. In fact, Henry misuses a line from Milton, the only direct quotation of Paradise Lost in the novel. Henry is depicted as a wanderer with a dislike of anything like a permanence of abode or limitation of society. In expressing this aversion to settling, Henry cites Milton as his first line of dialogue in the novel. Quote, "I consider the blessing of a wife most justly described in the discreet lines of the poet, heaven's last best gift." The quoted lines appositely come from the beginning of Book 5 of Paradise Lost, after Satan has entered paradise and spied on Adam and Eve, but before the pair have become aware of his presence. Adam addresses Eve, "Awake, my fairest, my espoused, my latest found, heaven's last best gift, my ever new delight." In his quotation, Henry profits from Milton's iambic meter to add extra weight to the stressed syllable last, and diminish the following word best. Where Adam uses last among other superlatives to indicate ultimate and long awaited, Henry uses it to insinuate that a wife and a home are to be willfully deferred, though recognized as inevitable. In this clever detour, Henry aligns himself with Satan as one who prioritizes the rhetorical features of language and uses them to manipulate meaning. He ultimately uses this rhetorical dexterity to persuade the eldest Bertram daughter, Mariam, to break her marital vows, the equivalent of the touch not prohibition of Paradise Lost. All of these disruptions coincide with movements in and out of the paradise of the country house and threaten its putative orderliness. Crucially, Sir Thomas's departure to Antigua and return to Mansfield open the door to the disturbances that will culminate in his daughter's adultery and the family's disgrace. It is not just the temporary absence of Sir Thomas's authority that allows chaos to emerge, but the ongoing oppressive pressure of that authority which provokes rebellion. As Said points out, Austen synchronizes Sir Thomas's authority at Mansfield with his rule in Antigua. That location is important because, compared to other Caribbean islands, Antigua was more turbulent, had more free Black people, and saw more agitation for emancipation. Sir Thomas's role was to maintain the existing order against these threats and indeed to make the plantation more profitable. We have only to turn to Mary Prince's History of Mary Prince to see what this authority looks like. While I was in that country, I saw how the field ends are worked in Antigua. They are worked very hard and fed but scantily. They are called out to work before daybreak and come home after dark. And then each has to leave his bundle of grass and the cattle in the pen. Then on Sunday morning, each slave has to go out and gather a large bundle of grass. And when they bring it home, they have to sit at the manager's door and wait till he come out. Often they have to wait till past 11 o'clock without any breakfast. Mary Prince was ultimately able to leverage the instability in Antigua to agitate for her own freedom. But none of this appears in Austen's novel. She uses Antigua as a kind of transparency laid over Mansfield Park, much like the transparency of Tintern Abbey that Fanny keeps in her room. But the English country house is where Austen centers her examination of a cosmetic social order that is as chaotic as it is repressive. That tension between chaos and cosmos manifests in Austen's language. Her evasiveness and doubleness and her use of irony and allegory recall Henry and Mary Crawford's rhetorical dexterity, marking how Mansfield Park figures language, the outer garment of ordered civilization, as itself fugitive and unmasterable. Discursive efforts to allocate place and race, and thus to imagine a legible universe, remain unstable. This reading of Mansfield Park demonstrates how my book, Poisoned Vestments, models rhetorical readings that do not return upon themselves like the snake biting its own tail. Instead, this form of reading helps better establish the relationship of Romantic era literature to the broader context of empire. Classical allusions and rhetorical language are not simply linguistic ornaments. They carry ideological weight in the battle to define Britain's imperial identity and literature's role in that identity. I want to turn now to the early American poet Phillis Wheatley Peters, a voice from the colonized world that Austen alludes to, but also represses, and which chapter 6 of my book discusses. I follow Honoré Fanon Jeffers in referring to the poet as Phillis Wheatley Peters. Jeffers has explained in several talks that she uses this name to honor Wheatley Peters' identity as a free woman. Named Phillis as a child after the slave ship that took her to Boston Harbor, and Wheatley after the family that bought her, Wheatley Peters made a symbolic statement by marrying a free African-American man, John Peters, upon her manumission. That history is important for the argument about chaos and cosmos because of the ways more benevolent enslavers saw enslaved people as unformed raw material that could be rendered legible or arranged in a cosmetic order via acts of naming, dressing, conversion, and other means of violent assimilation that sought to control the chaotic other. First, I want to explain the significance of a rhetorical reading of Wheatley Peters' poetry before I move on to this effort to control. So as Henry Louis Gates Jr. writes in Figures in Black, Words, Signs, and the Racial Self, early readers used poems on various subjects, along with other works like the Letters of Ignatius Sancho, as anti-slavery arguments, as proof that Black people were improvable and capable of high thought, and as tastes of the exotic. Quote, the documentary status of Black art assumed priority over mere literary judgment, and virtually no one discussed the book as poetry. By contrast, Ignatius Sancho wrote in a letter of 1778, Phillis's poems do credit to nature and put art merely as art to the blush. It reflects nothing either to the glory of her master, if she is still his slave, except he glories in the low vanity of having his wanton power and having in his wanton power a mind animated by heaven, a genius superior to himself. This is the same letter in which Sancho famously referred to Wheatley Peters as a genius in bondage, whom no good Samaritan thought to free. More hostile, usually white critics, characterized Wheatley's poetry as imitative and unoriginal. This was a common charge leveled against neoclassical writing. Romantics like Wordsworth criticized neoclassicism as mere imitation, a recombining of elements to produce texts that lack a living voice. Indeed, we might think of rhetorical manuals as the ChatGPT of their time. But such criticisms take on a different tenor when speaking of Phillis Wheatley Peters in the context of her enslavement. A rhetorical reading of Phillis Wheatley Peters' poetry that attends to both convergences and divergences in her work is a political act, taking Phillis Wheatley Peters as seriously as the innovative philosophical poet she was, not as a mechanical imitator or the mouthpiece of her enslavers. Jeffers makes all of this clear in The Age of Phillis, an innovative work of poetic creation or critical fabulation, to use Saidiya Hartman's term. And it is also a history stemming from years of archival work. Jeffers portrays Wheatley's classical and Christian education not as an act of benevolence, but as an attempt to both make and read Phillis Wheatley Peters as something legible to the white gaze. These violent acts of making and reading are compared to dressings. Of Susanna Wheatley, Jeffers writes, she took the child into her home, fed and bathed her, deciphered the naps on her head, dressed her in strange garments, gratitude and slavery, and so. Meanwhile, in Phillis Wheatley Embarks on Her Sea Voyage to London, Jeffers writes, she would go back 12 years to a childhood in a lost Gambia. The clocks would break. The muses wouldn't love her. They'd strip her of the letters of the English alphabet. She'd be a stranger to Christ, to fame, to Homer's antique name, to the eyes of the prying master race. In Mothering No. 2, the naps on Phillis Wheatley Peters' head are a language Susanna Wheatley doesn't understand and must undo. More than reading, she attempts to decipher them, to break the code. Ultimately, Susanna Wheatley makes this unreadable girl legible by dressing her in strange garments, gratitude and slavery. Jeffers can be said to use the rhetorical device of zeugma, where the verb dressing applies to literal Western garments, alluding also to the story of Wheatley Peters arriving naked and being wrapped in a carpet, and to the metaphorical garments of gratitude and slavery. These garments, both literal and metaphorical, assign Wheatley Peters a place in the world of British America. No longer a cipher recalling chaos, she now signifies. In Phillis Wheatley Embarks from Boston, Jeffers layers Wheatley Peters' first ocean crossing following her kidnap over her second crossing to oversee the publication of her book and restore her health. As Vincent Coretta notes, Wheatley Peters arrived in London just before the first anniversary of the Somerset ruling from which Mansfield Park derives its title, making her technically free in England. Jeffers imagines that journey turning back the clock, indeed breaking the measure of time. and Phillis being stripped by the muses of the English alphabet, the strange garment that she wore. Instead of disempowering her, that return to former nakedness removes the strange garment and makes her a stranger to Christ, to fame, to Homer's antique name, to the eyes of the prying master race. In the conditional mode Saidea Hartman assigns to critical fabulation, Wheatley Peters would become once more unreadable to the master race, free from their efforts to order the universe. I want to turn now to how Wheatley Peters herself envisions freedom from order in her own poetry, beginning with these lines from Thoughts on the Works of Providence. "Let there be light," he said from his profound. Old chaos heard and trembled at the sound. Swift as the word, inspired by power divine, behold the light around its maker shine. Wheatley Peters here adopts the ex materia doctrine of creation that Milton uses in Paradise Lost. Milton was Wheatley Peters' favorite modern poet, and in a letter written while in London, she recounts being presented with a folio edition of Milton's Paradise Lost, printed on a silver type, so called from its elegance. As Paul Lescoco argues in his 2014 book, Phillis Wheatley's Miltonic Poetics, Milton's writing constitutes the deep grammar of Wheatley's poetics. In opposition to the orthodox view that God created the world ex nihilo, from nothing, the theory of ex materia creation adopted by Milton stipulated that the world was created from matter by shaping chaotic material into legible form. That doctrine characterizes creation primarily as an act of adornment from which the ordered cosmos springs into being. Nature's beauties are considered as the dress with which God invests the universe, a signature of the divine. In Wheatley Peters' retelling of creation, old chaos trembles at being banished through this investiture. Images of adornment abound in Wheatley Peters' writing, mirroring the care the poet took with her own appearance and self-expression through material culture. As Christy Potroff argues, certain loved objects connected Wheatley Peters and her husband to networks of global exchange as well as local communities. And those objects, like the African-style nose ring that Jeffers was the first to detect in the frontispiece portrait, stand as markers of extra-textual forms of self-fashioning. As Potroff contends, quote, "The dynamic interplay between the creative mind and the material world is alive in Wheatley Peters' On Imagination," the poem from which John C. Shields postulates that Coleridge plagiarized his distinction between fancy and imagination, with fancy as an agent of the superior imaginative faculty. In my reading, On Imagination portrays acts of divine investiture, here attributed to classical rather than Christian gods in a syncretism of spiritual belief. Fair Flora may resume her fragrant reign, and with her flowery riches deck the plain. Sylvanus may diffuse his honors round, and all the forest may with leaves be crowned. Showers may descend, and dews their gems disclose, and nectar sparkle on the blooming rose. The framing of the poem makes clear that these are Wheatley Peters' own pleasing views with which fancy dresses to delight the muse. Hers is the divine imagination that invests the world with form and meaning, at once delighting in particulars and grasping the mighty whole. Unlike Milton, among others, Wheatley Peters does not envision this order as disciplinary or as establishing absolute boundaries that must not be transgressed. Neither does she reinforce Christian-derived absolute dichotomies between dark and light, day and night. If in thoughts morning adorns the heavenly plain, the sable veil that night and silence draws conceals effects but shows the almighty cause. Darkness does not stand for occlusion, but rather another form of revelation. It is worth noting that Wheatley Peters refers to Black people as the sable race and On being brought from Africa to America. where she rejects the notion of Blackness as a diabolic dye and a subversion of the Christian black-white, good-evil dichotomy. In Thoughts on the Works of Providence, day and sable night cross and greet one another in a chiasmus, quote, while day to night and night succeeds to day. Night is also associated with inner freedom, quote, when action ceases and ideas range licentious and unbounded o'er the plains. Day then gently restores reason after its necessary suspension. These flexible boundaries make way for overflowing tides of joy and infinite love. Antithetical to this freedom is the kind of chaos that ironically arises from efforts to establish control. In her poem to the Earl of Dartmouth on America's colonial status, Wheatley Peters declares, "No more America in mournful strain of wrongs and grievance unredressed complain. No longer shalt thou dread the iron chain, which wanton tyranny with lawless hand had made, and with it meant to enslave the land." The word unredressed is significant for its root in dress as right order. In their lawlessness, tyranny and enslavement refuse to redress, to put right, the wrongs and grievances of the oppressed. Wheatley Peters compares America's colonized status to her own enslaved status. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was the soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his beloved babe. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway? Wheatley Peters here offers a glimpse through her own experience of the total disruption of life on the African continent, wrought by the slave trade. On a micro level, the destruction of family structures. On a macro level, detribalization and ensuing conflict. To paraphrase Wheatley Peters, the wanton tyranny that masquerades as order unleashes chaos upon the world. And I've chosen a plate from Blake's America, a Prophecy here, because in that poem, Orc is sort of the representation of this repressed energy, that the more it is repressed, the more it explodes into rebellion. There's also a character named the Angel of Boston, who rends apart his robes that demonstrate a kind of fealty to royalism. As these readings demonstrate, Phillis Wheatley Peters does far more than imitate the classics and reiterate commonplaces. She reframes mutability not as chaos, but as freedom, dreams of unbounded space, of grasping the whole of the earth through flights of imagination, of crossings and migrations taken at one's own liberty. The cosmos she creates through her poetry is more expansive than that of Milton or Austen. And who better than an enslaved woman to imagine the cosmos otherwise? Thank you very much.
If everyone could please join me in giving Mariam a round of applause. And Mariam, you can stop sharing your screen so we can see as questions no doubt will pile in. Thank you for such a rich, what a rich talk. My mind is buzzing with questions, but before I take chair's privilege, I want to open the floor to others. Everyone's a bit gobsmacked with well, people are getting their thoughts together. There's something kind of bringing together the country house and particularly thinking about the tours of country house and admiring the gardens and the house and thinking about divine investiture. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between this imposition of order and kind of paeans to beauty and aesthetics, and if that features in your thinking at all.
Yes, absolutely. And I see the southern scenes in Mansfield Park, where the Bertrams visit Southerton, which is the home of Maria Bertram's fiance, Rushworth, I believe, if I'm remembering the name correctly. This is where, for me and Austen, there is this compression of allegorical meaning as they're admiring this landscape. And at the same time, there is talk of a serpentine path, and there are moments of rhetorical manipulation where Henry persuades Maria to go around the gate without her future husband, bringing the key and giving his permission. And there is talk of a sort of doing penance and the oppressive heat of the day. And so that we have this sort of ordered paradise, right? And this reference to Humphrey Repton's improvement. And at the same time, layered upon it is this sort of chaotic hellscape, which slave plantations were often compared to oppressive heat, right? And so this is part of what I mean by Antigua as a transparency laid over Mansfield Park. And so for me, this is one of the richest ways in which Austen portrays that chaos and cosmos as two sides of the same coin.
Thank you, that's wonderful. Open the floor to other questions. You can raise your hand or type something into the chat. And if you'd like to turn your videos back on, I'm sure your faces would be welcome to. While people are waiting, I'm going to sort of expand the conversation and sort of ask about how to make this a question and not more of a comment. So really don't want to do that numbers, but yeah, I guess thinking about the transatlantic nature of the project, and whether or how you're positioning it in the larger disciplinary discussions about English versus American literature. I'm sorry to throw that massive question, but it struck me as curious is that along the many divides that often limit what we look at or how we look at them, the question of is this English literature or is this American literature is one that kind of steers the way we can look at texts. And I wanted to ask you if that was something that had informed any of your thinking, or if I was just being mad and unhelpful.
No, absolutely. I mean, and I think this division between English and American is one of the ways that sort of artificial boundaries are imposed, right? Disciplinary boundaries. But Phillis Wheatley Peters was enslaved in British America. She received the kind of education that one would receive in Britain, the classical education. Her favorite poets were Milton and Pope. Her favorite classical poets were people like Terence and Catullus. And she published her book in London and made that sea voyage to see it through to publication and to restore her health. So there are all of these transatlantic connections already embedded in Phillis Wheatley Peters's sort of education and history of publication. And I think too, one thing that the Mansfield case makes clear to me is this effort to separate colonies in which there is enslavement, and Britain and England in which there are no slaves, right? William Cooper says slaves cannot breathe in England, right? Because English air is free. And there's sort of this cognitive dissonance, right? That actually England is the colonial heart of this empire, and what establishes slavery in the colonies. So I see this effort to sort of distinguish colonial literature from the colonized world with British literature or English literature as a way of denying those connections, the sort of tentacles of empire reaching across the globe. So that's one of the ways I'm thinking through that question.
Thank you. I think that feeds into the question that Susan just popped into the chat. Susan, do you want to ask your question, or shall I summarize for you? She asked if you could talk a little bit about the origins of your project.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Susan. So the origins of the project really have to do with Wordsworth's citation of the poisoned vestment of Hercules and Nessus, and the third essay on epitaphs, which I read in a class led by Cynthia Chase at Cornell, right? And this is the moment, and there are a couple of moments that are brought together to create this sort of emblem of the poisoned vestment, where Wordsworth says that if words are not an incarnation of thought, but merely a clothing for it, then they are a poisoned vestment that seeks to alienate from his right mind and to destroy the person who puts them on, right? And this is drawing from the tale of the poisoned coat of Nessus that destroys Hercules. And it's one of the examples, many examples of the ill gift in classical literature, right? Like Pandora's box that unleashes chaos upon the world. And I was struck by how seriously Wordsworth took poetic language, and the ways that that image also sort of reaches its tentacles in many different directions. And I started to think about actual dress and commercial culture, all things which appear in Wordsworth's poetry. And the ways that Wordsworth thought about how modernity had to do with the separation of signs from their meanings, right? The mere dress of thought rather than its incarnation. The sense of living in a sort of disconnected place. And Wordsworth is sort of criticizing the ways that this influences the thoughts of the English, right? It destroys the mind of the English. All of these, so it's a sort of critique of empire, but it's more focused on the imperial center, really, and the implication for thought. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question, Susan.
Thank you, Mariam. And Emily Senior has her hand up. Emily?
Hi, hi. Sorry, I'm having a tech failure, so tell me to shut up if this has already been discussed, because I think I missed a bit. But I was really interested, Mariam. Thank you for your for the point about the transparency, which is so sort of rich for thinking about, and I hadn't known about before. So thank you for that. And I suppose I was wondering about kind of other kinds of visual representations of tropical landscapes, and how we might think about the transparency of Antigua over Mansfield Park in relation to those other sorts of visual productions, and the importance of new visual media more generally in relation to things like panorama and so on, and big images of empire. So I suppose sort of broadly, if there's anything interesting to say about that, I'd be delighted to hear it. And then I suppose if there is also a link between those kinds of visual productions and your neoclassical emphasis, that would be really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really fascinating question. I'm not sure if it's quite connected, but I've written in the past about sort of Byron's commercial portraiture and the ways that it creates this sort of other ghostly Byronic figure completely separate from the historical poet. And that's the same kind of separation between sign and meaning that's part of what I'm talking about here as Wordsworth's anxiety. The ways that sort of commercial portraiture creates this empty image. And the sort of in one chapter of the book, I discuss Byron and the image of the dandy, which is part of this complex taxonomy of pretty gentlemen. In Byron's play Sardanapalus, which is the story of this Assyrian emperor, this ancient Assyrian emperor who dresses like a woman, and consequently his empire falls apart, right? And so this is alluding to all kinds of aspects of material culture, such as the Prince Regent's Brighton Pavilion, for instance, which is decorated in this Oriental style. So there are all these visual representations of Orientalism and of Byron in Oriental dress. And so this is also connected to this aesthetic and Orientalism as something that is, of course, a projection of Western thought, this chaotic other, something that is aestheticized as a mere image overlaid onto this English landscape. As to your other question about transparency, where that sort of figure comes from is from Fanny's transparency of Tintern Abbey that she has in her East Room. And so I haven't quite worked out, to be honest, this sort of connection between what I'm talking about, the transparency of Antigua and the transparency of Tintern Abbey, but it's this question of seeing through something, of sort of attempting to get beyond signs to meaning.
And maybe also tracing, because isn't that how transparencies are made?
Yes, absolutely, tracing something on the surface of something else.
That's We've got time for one last question. Lucy Moynihan wants to know if you could talk a little bit more about the reception, particularly of Phillis Wheatley Peters' work on both sides of the Atlantic, and particularly who was buying and collecting her and reading her works.
Yes, that's a good question. I haven't touched very much on reception in my work, but Phillis Wheatley Peters was quite widely read. And I mean, there were also very racist readings of her, people like Thomas Jefferson saying that her work didn't really constitute poetry. And in London, she was received by people like Granville Sharp, the abolitionist. And of course, she had an aristocratic patroness, whose name I'm forgetting now. But the ways that Phillis Wheatley Peters encountered her was she wrote an elegy, or rather a sort of an elegy on the death of her, of Whitefield, and that caught the attention of this aristocratic patron. And of course, Wheatley Peters's publications were published in American newspapers, and that was how she became her patroness. So there are all these sort of transatlantic networks that show Phillis Wheatley Peters's sort of visibility and importance in the literary landscape on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you. Any last words before I ask everyone to join in once again in thanking Mariam for rounding out a wonderful year of rich talks and exciting new approaches to 18th century studies? Lots of thanks in the chat. Then just please join me in clapping, putting your thumbs up, unmuting and shouting hurrah, anything that you are moved to do. And just so thank Mariam once again for a wonderful talk. And thank you all, supporters of ODSECS, for a year of fantastic talks. And I hope to see many of you again in the autumn when we resume for the next academic year.